All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Day 2 of the NSF-funded Reset Conference. I am Dr. Quincy Brown, and I am here to host and introduce our wonderful speaker for the session entitled After Hours Learning, Workshops for Professional Women to Learn Web Development. So next slide, let's see. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jocelyn Pena. Her bio is there. I'll just read some snippets. She is a visiting assistant professor of computer science at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she focuses on understanding how we teach and engage underrepresented groups in computer science education. She is keen on understanding how to solve design and computing problems through the lens of the user. We so desperately need that. Before doing this work, she was a human factors research associate in the Human-Centered Systems Group at Honeywell Aerospace. She has an undergraduate degree in multimedia web design and development, and a master's and PhD degrees in information science and technology and informatics, both from Penn State. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jocelyn Pena. And I'll share that she's going to do her presentation at the end. She'll leave some time for questions. So if you have questions for her, you can save them till the end. There'll be time. You can type them in the chat. I'll do my best at monitoring that and making sure I gather all the questions. And then at the end, we'll have time for that. All right, there you go, Dr. Pena.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And so before I get into it, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I know it's also Friday, so it's one of those days as usual, but first and foremost, also, this is part of my dissertation work, so I'm really excited to share it. So first off, I'm just going to start off with an introduction here. I think this is kind of a statement that we've all heard of before, right? Underrepresentation in STEM and computing is a continuing problem. Pew Research and NCWIT report regularly a ton of different statistics, of course, but one being that since the mid to late 90s, we have actually seen a decrease in bachelor's degrees. So I'm not talking about anything else, right? Like just the statistic of a decrease in bachelor's degrees in CS, right? Obviously, there could be a different number with like potential like steady or gradual rise, right, in CS in general. When we talk about the attainment of the degrees, right, and that can tie into retention, we're seeing that decrease, right? Like there's a steady decrease. Okay, and something that I've been interested in, right? We all know that the computing pipeline is something that's of interest to all of us in terms of broadening participation. But something I became more interested in is this largely ignored subgroup that may not be sort of paid attention to much in this pipeline, and that's this sort of subgroup of women non-programmers. So these are women who might be working professionals. They might even be in non-technical positions. They may also be individuals that didn't have a chance to learn programming, right? So if they went to college in the 80s, even in the early 90s, they may not have had that opportunity, right? Where now we're starting to see that increase of AP CS courses, CS in high school, even in middle school, right? So I'm interested in this sort of subgroup of like adult women, right? Who, again, these working professionals, they may be, you know, in their middle age or even older adults, late age group in their careers. So another statistic here from the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that the middle-aged population is becoming larger within the general population, right? And that makes sense, right? So individuals are getting older, right? And then that population itself is increasing. It's getting really large. And then women's representation in computing workforce has notably dipped since 2010. So this is also an interesting statistic where, again, if I'm thinking about the professional workforce and women in that workforce or individuals that identify as women in the workforce, the computing workforce, that subgroup of individuals, right, like that has actually dipped, right? And that's for a variety of different reasons, but something that I'm thinking is we can point to different events that have recently happened in the news, right? Where either either sort of like equal pay, right? Or anything like that, right? And as well as just kind of like the advent of reporting of harassment in the workplace, right? Like there's so many other factors that play into this. Okay. Okay. So again, harkening back to this sort of what I'm calling this niche kind of subgroup of like adult work learners who are also professional, like working women, but they're sort of in a middle age or like older age bracket, right? And again, they may not be wanting to pursue a computer science degree at a later point in their lives, but they're still interested in it, right? And they had never had a chance to fully sort of immerse themselves and dive in, right? So I first started to think about like, well, what are these approaches to attracting informal adult learners in general, right? So MOOCs, right, are a big thing. Self-directed learning, right, like YouTube, LinkedIn Learning, Code.org, Code Academy, all of these different things. And then we think about professional development activities. So you might have through their company or their institution, potentially events that come through from other external agencies or just other individuals themselves who want to provide some sort of learning opportunity for, basic programming skills or what I would just say more technical skills. Okay, and then we also have boot camps, which are a big thing, of course, like a really more intense 6 to 12 week preparatory skill kind of environment, where the major goal of this, though, is to actually help someone pivot their career, right? So there's a distinction here, right? So people that are enrolling themselves in boot camps, they're actually paying, and mostly their goals are to actually change their careers, right? So again, the focus that I'm sort of honing in on here is, what if you have individuals, again, these professional working women who are non-programmers, non-technical, they want to learn the computational technical stuff, but they're not interested in actually pivoting their careers. They're actually happy where they're at. So again, this is a very sort of niche group of individuals, I would say, right? And then we have workshops, which is what I'm focusing on now. And they're sort of kind of a combination of all of these things. They can be asynchronous or synchronous. They could be virtual, in person, but they incorporate prior aspects of these other approaches, but then also other social aspects, let's just say, right? So this is sort of where I want to focus on for this presentation. And then we have this workshop that I helped sort of develop, but also the founder of this workshop kind of reached out to me to sort of work to design it from the ground up and just distribute it and deliver it at Penn State's campus. So Code for Her, it's a 9-week workshop for faculty and staff and students who identify as women at Penn State. There were these 2 cohorts that met once a week, right? And the things that we tried to focus on were active learning strategies, trying to create an inclusive environment. It was free, it was non-credit bearing, there were no exams, homeworks, or assignments, but it was project-based. And again, it had sort of kind of a structured curriculum within an informal environment. So this workshop was, kind of crafted as best as I could, thinking about who was coming to the workshop. Now, there is a student version of this workshop, but for this presentation, I'm not focusing on that. Most of my research was on the faculty and staff as working professional women in this section. So here you can see some actual live pictures that we took in person. This was before COVID, with the workshop being held. So guides and lenses, just things that guided sort of my thinking about this, whether that be the design of the workshop, how I thought about, implementation of the workshop, the delivery, the behaviors that I was wanting to see and look for and instill in the participants. So constructivism, just the, basically the idea that I I want my participants to be active in their learning, right? I don't want to actually be the center of attention and the authoritative figure. I actually want individuals to use their experience to construct knowledge, not only by what I'm saying, but use, again, their experience, the individuals around them, their social components. It's not all about sort of the technical aspects too, right? And so using experience, using the individuals around you and being active in your learning, right? So creating opportunities where, again, it's not only me, I'm cheering on as like a guide on the side, right? Providing answers, again, narratives, experience of my own, and being vulnerable with the participants too. Cultural perspectives too were a big thing. So I kind of relied on sort of critical approaches like feminist pedagogy, space and place, learning climates. These are all different things that made me think about the culture of the classroom or the inclusivity, all of the things that I wanted to create that I think do not normally exist in CS classrooms, I would say, right? So learning climates being like, what is the climate of the classroom? Is it hostile? Is it negative? Is it a place where you're not allowed to voice your opinion without feeling a certain way? Space and place, right? Is it a place where you can feel actually safe, comfortable, have fun, create experiences that stay with you, right? And then this sort of feminist approach or critical approach, which is, resisting hierarchy or challenging the traditional status quo of what it means to be either a woman in CS or someone who is not traditionally known to be in CS, right? Like challenging the narrative and challenging, the stereotypes, right? And then also CS education as professional development. I wanted to think of it in that form as well, because again, just hearkening back to these individuals, they're not actually looking to pivot. A lot of the faculty and staff at Penn State who were in these workshops were actually, again, not technical in nature, did not identify as like having a lot of base tech skills. So these are individuals that found themselves in other disciplines or, other types of jobs or opportunities that came to take this workshop. Okay, so I saw this also as like, we can call it professional development too. And what does that work say about what individuals want? Okay, so I talked a bit maybe already about these guides and lenses and things that made me think about how I wanted to design the workshop. That was a huge piece of this research is I can't just, teach a class or teach something without carefully thinking about what I want out of it and what I want to instill and what are the things that I think will help sort of create the best environment. So there's some design principles here that I'll list that I, again, had these high level design goals for in designing the workshop. They're not all, but I just want to name some of them here. So low barrier to entry, because of web development being sort of this easy access way to program things, but also have like the really high reward where you can immediately see your progress, like as you refresh your browser. It sort of helps novices or these particular individuals sort of make progress quickly and get that sort of, kind of real world like guarantee right in their face as they're like refreshing the screen. Live coding and code dissection. So this seems pretty trivial, but being able to demystify sort of like the process of what it means to code, like just the culture of it is also eye-opening, right? Like it doesn't have to be like it's, a guy coding, right? Like what we unfortunately think of what a normal programmer is, right? It's more than that. So bringing up like, like the process of what it means to, look under the hood of like a website or dissect code line by line. So they're able to interpret what it means and what are the relationships between different things. That was a big thing. Having a role models, right? So again, me being one of the instructors and facilitators and having workshop leaders, like having other women who were in different stages of their careers, whether academic or not, but they weren't professional programmers, kind of made it so that they had these informal role models as well to say like, hey, I can do this too. And again, this informal atmosphere, which was super important, right? Like the workshop itself was free and non-credit bearing, and you were able to sign up voluntarily. But again, having this sort of balance between a structured curriculum, but then also not making it super high stress, making it laid back so people can actually build social relationships, which again is something hard to achieve in a normal, like what I would say a normal like CS course, right? Because you're like throwing a bunch of different topics, like either every day or every other day or every week to just cover everything as much as you can in 16 weeks. And it's really hard to kind of, have the other side of things too, which can definitely help the learning environment and the climate. And then also free open source tools. So again, even though we are not professional programmers, or like the workshop team wasn't, we still do program. And we also wanted to instill that idea of like, here are these free open source tools that you can use to tinker with and play around with in the workshop, outside of the workshop, and make it feel like this is actually stuff that industry level people do too, and like use and encounter. Okay. So just a quick example of what I mean, right? So, this is just a piece or a snippet of code, like a screenshot. And I have a circle here just saying like, if I wanted to actually dissect this, I would hone in on a block of code. This is CSS, so like this design part of the website. You'll also see some HTML, and then you'll also see some like JavaScript at the bottom. Is being able to hone in, explain literally line by line, which is something that's not really done sometimes, again, in teaching like some of the programming classes in CS, right? Is sometimes there's not time for that, and sometimes you just kind of do a high level kind of glossing over topics, which is fine, right? But I think something that I missed when I was also like in computer science classes in college is I wished that someone would actually like break it down even further, right? And again, even though it seems simple and trivial, this is a big part of that, right? Being able to hone in and then explain what are the relationships between these different languages in this one file, right? So again, just breaking down a little bit, I won't go over everything just for time, but these are some topics, tools and topics that we went through. Again, we used a lot of tools. We went through HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it was a nice kind of flow that ended with a project. So something I followed again with this sort of design process is I held 4 workshops of this over 2 years. And each workshop was an iteration of itself, right? So what I mean by that is they all built upon each other. And interestingly enough, I served as like the instructor, the designer, and the researcher. So I held many hats, but even though that's kind of good, but it's also something to be aware of in terms of bias, is that like I had my hand in everything. And so definitely there's room for bias in terms of how I designed things, how I ran things, and how I analyzed things, behaviors, observations. So this is just a quick example of this sort of workshop ecosystem. Again, you can just see like there's the design of all these aspects. You have the workshop. I got feedback from participants, and then I kind of redesigned each iteration or each semester of the workshop, and then kind of refined or modified as needed. Okay. And again, for the sake of time, I can't go over everything, but I did want to show this graphic to hopefully help illustrate sort of that process. So in terms of recruitment, right? So 4 semesters over 2 years, emails, word of mouth. There was a 3-week recruitment period. And again, you just kind of had to apply and say that you were interested in, right? And so the workshop team kind of reviewed applications, and unfortunately there were so many each semester, like 120 people, like per cohort, even including the student section. But yeah, it became hard to choose people. And so we just had to try and find a system to choose 30 people max, just based on like how many people we can fit in a certain classroom. So, but it was definitely really popular. And this was an example of what that poster looked like. Okay. So now I just want to kind of go over the results. And again, I'm looking at time. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So if I don't get through everything in terms of the results, that's okay. Of course, the slides are going to be available. And of course, if you have access to the paper when it does get published, you're more than welcome to check that out. So I'll try to get through as much as I can with the time. So some measures, things that I was interested in, were sort of these behaviors and measures of like self-efficacy, which is a really, traditional, common measurement, I would say, being used in like CS education right now. Future behavior was something that I created, and then I had some open-ended questions that were just meant to have the participants elaborate more. And at the bottom, you can sort of see, again, a schedule of what that looked like in terms of collecting data. So there was a pre-survey, there was a post-survey, there was a midpoint reflection, there were even focus groups. So I collected a lot of data, again, things that I won't go over in summary here, but I'll try to touch on some things as best as I can. So in the year one, I'm having a combination of fall 2018 and spring 2019. I kind of use these two almost as like a pilot, for lack of a better word, but I wanted to understand and get a good amount of data from both sections, which would be around 50 to 60 people, to sort of see any observations or any trends, right? So in self-efficacy, these are some of the items that I asked in this sort of construct. And you can see that like pre-post workshop, like the means, like 2.1 to 4.6, generally they increased, which is good, right? Of course, there's also sort of the inflation of like, if you're going to ask someone right after a survey or right after an event, sure, they're going to answer that it's better, right? That it's increased. But you'll see that there's these sort of significant changes, which is really important. That says a lot about the trends and behaviors, right? So they're more efficacious. And then in future behavior, you'll see that I was interested in what would this mean if you took this workshop in 9 weeks and then, down the road, can you see any other type of involvement, right? Like, are you more likely to code or willing to collaborate on a project or share what you learned with other people? And again, this first one, post workshop, it says here, they saw themselves as more likely to code after. That was significant, but all of these other ones weren't. And so again, it doesn't really say too much about their future behavior. A lot of these pre-workshop averages started high anyways. So definitely in terms of thinking about future behavior, I gave some thought to whether this instrument that I created was good enough to measure what I was intending to measure. So sort of reflecting over the first year, right? Just again, these two major behavioral measurements and constructs that I was interested in. I also held 2 focus groups, and I uncovered other behaviors that the surveys didn't sort of mention, which was, it wasn't really technical for them, right? Which is what I tried to hearken back in the beginning is it wasn't, I want to market myself for future jobs, which again was a benefit, but they really took this to sort of the social cultural aspects in their communities and their lives, right? So they talked to their family members and workplace colleagues. They sort of began to breach common ground with tech individuals in their community and their families. Understanding like jargon about coding, which is interesting. They were interested in embarking on social issues of computing, like donating or volunteering, which was really interesting to me. And then speaking out. So almost kind of like activism, though I don't want to say truly activism, of course. But then also using skills in teaching or other things, other aspects of their daily lives. So I found that a lot of the participants spoke at length about, well, I was able to feel comfortable to, troubleshoot my smart refrigerator at home. And I'm like, that's an interesting comparison, is that there's these computational related activities that are not necessarily programming, but they're finding themselves more motivated and confident to feel like they can actually achieve those things, right? Which then sort of bleeds into other aspects of their lives. So with those behaviors that I kind of found through the focus groups as well, I sort of changed some of the measurements, some of the evaluation items, and I threw out that initial sort of behavioral construct as well. I also had an emerging concept, which is computational grounding. So I was thinking more about like these individuals kept talking about their grounding themselves towards more computational activities that are not just programming, right? And so I was thinking about this orientation towards computational skills and what does that mean, right? And sort of like in the back of my mind. Okay. And then comes year 2. So I have with sort of what I learned in year 1, I again changing the iteration of what these workshops look like in terms of some refinement and feedback, but also thinking about what I'm asking, right? What am I asking so I could ask more pointed questions and understand better their attitudes and how they're using this workshop in their daily lives. So again, these are some more extensive sets of measures. So I kept sort of self-efficacy, but I added these other constructs, sort of technology culture, technology at work, technology common ground, and tech initiative. So these are all different constructs getting at different types of behaviors that again derived directly from the first year of surveys and the focus groups, right? Understanding that there were other behaviors and things at play here. Okay. So again, I'm just going to go over at just 2 of these, again, just for time. But you can see here sort of with these this is expanded coding self-efficacy measure. You're seeing the average. This is going to be overall versus each item here. But overall, you'll see an increase. And this was also significant, so, right? So I can explain to a novice what it means to code. So themselves being a novice, right? Like, interestingly enough, they feel that they can actually then talk to someone else and say, I think I can explain what it means to code to someone or what it means to code in web development, which is really interesting. Changes in technology common ground. So again, breaching that was really important to these individuals, whether that be in their family members' lives, in their workplace, whether they're like a librarian and they're trying to breach common ground with an IT person in that, workplace. That was something that they found that they were able to do. They can have discussions with developers or other people about programming and not feel like their voice isn't heard. So just skipping a little bit here, I want to sort of move into the qualitative themes, right? So again, these are other parts that came out of open-ended questions from all of the surveys, right? So those surveys had a mix of quantitative components, right? Like pointed measured questions, numerical questions versus sort of these open-ended. And again, there were many themes that sort of emerged, but I want to cover a few here. So again, I kind of took everything top down and bottom up and sort of mapped them. Okay. And here's sort of an example, right? So I mapped this to one of the cultural perspectives that was sort of guiding me here, but this particular participant mentioned it's extremely important for me to be in a safe space to learn. I'm naturally a shy person and I've spent my whole life having men talk over me. I feel like women are more collaborative and less apt to want to upstage, for example, an instructor. So that was really interesting. And then also this particular sort of quote that really is sort of encapsulating everything is, this idea of challenging traditional CS, moving towards this sort of critical, like feminist approach in the classroom. Here, this participant mentioned, it is important to provide inclusive environments for all gender identities since CS is generally a male-dominated field. And then also I'll highlight the underlined here is I also see this in the lack of gender diversity at higher academic levels, professors and deans. A program or workshop like this could help pave the way for a more diverse and welcoming world of programming. So again, lots of positive comments, but there's other themes that emerged that had to do with, again, more of their attitudes and even just workshop design feedback as well. So in terms of the discussion, I want to try to sort of bring and tie everything up together, which I know is a lot. But here's something interesting. So there's this, I think this is from Philip Guo, who he studied older adult programmers. There was this sort of, I think, spectrum, if you will, of like, what does it mean for someone to be a programmer and like types of programmers? There's like the non-programmer, there's like the professional programmer, like at Facebook or Google. There's like the end user programmer who's like only doing things when they can. as needed. And then the conversational programmer, which is this interesting piece of literature that kind of came up from this, is that the code for her participants, the faculty and staff who are these non-technical, perhaps individuals, but are yearning to learn more, right? They're sort of these conversational programmers, but adjusted, right? Because these individuals, their conversational nature, they want to talk about programming. They might be on the periphery of the programming community, but they're interested in actually marketability. They actually want to pivot their careers and like get promotions and like make more money, let's just say. But the code for her participants, I found, again, this niche community of individuals, they value other things too, not just the learning of programming and what it is, what does it mean to program in web development, but it's also like more than professional, it's personal too, right? It's all these other aspects of being a role model themselves, talking to other individuals, participating in activism, perhaps with coding, right? Like, what does it mean to get equal pay? To have a woman get paid the same amount as a man for being a senior engineer, right? So I find this super, super interesting, right? Like they're sort of in this spectrum kind of, but not really, right? There really isn't like a name. I wouldn't call them any of these actually. And then feminist pedagogy, right? So little work has actually documented the use of this. I mean, maybe there has been, of course, individuals that have done it, but it hasn't been documented in research. I saw like a couple of papers using it in more engineering curricula, like civil or mechanical. And this sort of perspective is currently invisible in these classrooms. So I'm thinking, you know, empowering individuals and sharing power is super, super important. Challenging the status quo. If we can introduce that and increase like the climate in these classrooms, I think perhaps that might be better, right? Like in terms of creating more well-rounded individuals who are actually socially and culturally aware, which is very much what we need, especially with the advent of like, you know, things that are not ethical with privacy and algorithms. We want to like cultivate a classroom where people are challenging the status quo, but also challenging stereotypes and being able to come out more well-rounded, right? And being able to challenge what's going on in society right now. And I mentioned here too, there's other amazing perspectives like culturally responsive pedagogy, which is definitely something to look into that has similar goals. Expanding the computing pipeline. So I've mentioned this before, is that we know that broadening participation is important for K through 12, young women, of course, focusing on racial minorities like Hispanic women, African Americans, Native individuals, disabled persons, right? Like all of this is good, but I find it interesting that, you know, we have code.org and Girls Who Code and all of these other initiatives, which again are amazing, but I wonder what it would look like to actually focus on this niche group of individuals. Like, how do we target them? And I think that that's really hard, right? Like they want to learn, explore it for fun, whether that be for professional reasons or not. And the boat hasn't sailed yet on like their interest, and like, how do we get to them, I think is interesting. And I put here as well, alteration of academic and industry spaces. I think that obviously that's something that probably has been spoken a lot about already in previous sessions and things like that, but that's something that we should focus on too. Something else that I wanted to mention too is that Code for Her was actually initiated by Penn State libraries. So it wasn't founded by any particular discipline at Penn State, which I find very interesting. And so I think a lot of the success of the workshop in terms of the behaviors we saw and the learning and everything also had to do a lot with it being actually located like physically in the libraries, but from the libraries, right? Like, what does it mean to have them as a role in lifelong learning and computing, right? They value a lot of these missions or these mission statements that we're trying to achieve here. And I just find it interesting that a lot of people mentioned too in their surveys, which I didn't sort of post, but they thought that it was like a less hostile environment. Whereas if they thought it were actually like being hosted by like the actual CS department at Penn State or something like that, they actually wouldn't have applied. So just feeling like just the physical space is kind of important. and seeing libraries as almost this like neutral, for lack of a better word, zone for these individuals who like have experienced weary or hostile environments in computing and CS. Like maybe hosting these types of workshops there is like a way to be super inviting and reach a lot of other individuals who might be scared to sort of come out and pursue their interests. So again, just limitations and future work, right? This is a pretty extensive project. Like I said, I didn't mention a good chunk of it here in this presentation, but the sample sizes of the workshop. So I mentioned it was held over 4 semesters, and each workshop or instance of it had around 25 to 30 people. So obviously like statistical volume in terms of like these measures and behaviors probably would be better, right? Just in terms of talking statistics and significance and all of that. But for the, compromising the experience, I didn't want to allow that many people because I wanted to be able to physically like help everyone and create the climate that I wanted without sort of the huge quantity. Again, bias as myself, just being in all different facets of this work is something that I have to acknowledge. Focus groups. So I didn't get to hold the last focus group actually last spring because of COVID. So we went through the last workshop, and when it hit, April was sort of the last month and I couldn't hold that. So that was definitely one thing that I wish I would have gotten a chance to do. And then just in terms of, again, the sample just from Penn State, that's a really unique community in the middle of Pennsylvania. So what would this have looked like if I implemented this workshop at a place like where I'm living now in St. Paul, right? Like that's completely different than like in the middle of State College, Pennsylvania, right? And something else that I didn't mention at all is that I collected their projects each semester. So all of their web projects, which I have, and I'm going to do sort of future analysis on this to see what are some other insights that I can find about how they coded and maybe some of their design behaviors as well. Okay, so again, takeaways. The computing pipeline, I think that it should be expanded to focus on this niche group. I think a big question is how, unless you're not doing these, in-person workshops. Sort of professional women in these non-technical careers should have an opportunity to learn about programming, but again, how and where and what should that be, and like the crafting of the design is important. And again, designing opportunities that I think not only should be in these informal workshops, but also like should be taken into actual CS classrooms, like in undergraduate curriculums, right? Is like, let's continue to include like these relevant cultural perspectives, like critical computing and culturally responsive computing, right? And sort of harkening back to this computational grounding insight, this is something that I want to continue to measure more. I just haven't had a chance to do that yet. So that's just one thing that I'm still working on. But with that being said, that was a lot. So I want to thank you all for your patience and consideration. And I want to thank my committee here, who's listed, because part of this was my dissertation work. I want to thank the Sloan Scholarship. And I also want to thank the individuals at the university libraries who allowed us to do the research and heavily involve ourselves in this. So thank you all very much.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, Dr. Pena. I was going to say, yay.
Thank you.
So, I've got 2 questions that I'll ask together,
Sure.
both from Michelle Foreman.
Okay.
And they are, the first one is, did you research salary of women in IT versus their male counterparts?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I didn't. And I'm like kicking myself for that because there were other things that I wanted to ask and I didn't. And I thought about it after the fact. So I really wanted to even do a comparison of like background, like their education and like you said, salary and even, socioeconomic status and things like that. I didn't ask like 2 of those questions. So yeah, I'm kicking myself about it for sure.
But there's more research to be done.
Yes.
And then the second question is, have you included project managers and business analysts as those with non-technical careers?
That's a great question. So I think we had individuals I think either from HR or like business admin or administration actively that participated in the workshop. And that's definitely something, I think I actually mentioned this in the paper. If you do get a chance to look at it, there is a breakdown of disciplinary and also professional affiliations, which I didn't include in the slides here, but there's a breakdown of that in the paper, and I think that there is mention of those types. Yes.
Awesome. And then I have one short question for you, and then we're just about out of time. So
Sure.
you kind of touched on this at the end. I'm wondering if you think that colleges and universities would be a good place to offer similar workshops for, non-degree seeking students, right? Similar to what you did, but maybe more as part of the departments, or if you think that would turn people away, because you mentioned that if it had been advertised as such, people said, they probably wouldn't come. So like, how do you find that middle ground? Or maybe that's not the best environment. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks, Quincy. So it's interesting because we were going to offer it through like the advertisement and like even the physical space of like CS or like CS or IST at Penn State, but it was just interesting. The response we got like after like the first two workshops was like pretty like extensive. Like a lot of people were interested, and like we just kind of thought to ourselves like what would have been different. Like I think it would have been different if it was sponsored or affiliated even like from the other parts of these disciplines or departments. But I think it's definitely going to be different. And I think part of it too is like just even like negative connotations that people generally have with like CS and like, ooh, like there might be like really, I don't know, like harsh individuals who may not listen to me, just like negative environments and experiences that already kind of flooded their mindset about what it means to like join something that's out of their comfort zone and like CS community related that like I don't want to say scared them, but definitely stopped them. So I don't know. I think that it can be done for sure. I just don't know how, right? Like I don't know, how. I think part of it is marketing, part of it is changing like what it means for people to perceive what it means to be in CS and a CS department. Like that should be supportive and not negative. But yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Part of it is I don't know too. So
No, I mean, in the beginning, you touched on right creating inclusive
yeah.
environments, and I think it's something for everyone to think about all of the facets and pieces of an environment that make it inclusive. So I appreciate you sharing your research with us.
Yeah,
We are
absolutely.
pretty much out of time. Did you want to have like one sentence wrap up before we go?
Well, sure. I guess I just wanted to say thank you all again for sort of joining me. And I really just want to thank Quincy for just helping me with the presentation and just kind of answering my million questions. But also, if you do have other questions for me, I'm very, very much happy to either chat with you over email, which I have listed here, or just try to reach out to me, I guess through Hoover as well. So really just thank you all so much for your patience and coming. So yeah,
All right. Awesome. Thank you. Everyone have enjoyed the rest of the conference.
thanks everyone.
Bye.